Today's new Tavern Brawl, this week's new Tavern Brawl, is absolutely fascinating. As you can see from this portrait here, this guy is deciding to bring an Ooze Hellfire deck, which is not a good idea. But what you do is you bring 2 cards in your deck. Now, I've actually had the pleasure of, since I tend to stream a little bit later than when the Brawl first releases, I can, when I wake up, before I start streaming, I look at Reddit, I look at some general sites, and I know the general idea of what decks are out there. So here's a quick rundown of some good decks. Now, I actually consider this a really interesting brawl. First of all, because 1, finding the optimal decks is a step, but 2, after that, finding the correct deck to bring into the metagame is correct too. And this is kind of like a small window into the general idea of meta or deck construction as a whole. So the first thing to think about is that Ice Block is pretty overpowered, because the only way to beat 15 Ice Blocks, since there are 15 Ice Blocks in your deck, basically Flare Kazan or Eater or Fatigue, one of the two. Or possibly Loatheb, if you manage to get that up in time. So one of the strategies that came about after a little bit of discovery is this Ice Block Fireball deck. And that seems really good. It's a good baseline. It should always be a strong contender because you always have to think about beating it. So that was an interesting thing. Of course, that cropped up after the initial aggro decks all came about. There were good ideas like Tunnel Trog plus Feral Spirit or Tunnel Trog plus Totem Golem or Tunnel Trog plus, where is that card? Dust Devil. I mean, that's a pretty aggressive deck. I mean, that's just your natural aggressive deck. There's decks that try to abuse Innervate and then big stuff like Innervate and Yashiraj, where you get a 10-10 each turn after you Innervate out Yashiraj on turn 2 or 3 or something, or Innervate Deathwing, so that once you put out the Deathwing, it's great. But as you can see, even a deck that has this unfair element, something like this, it gets out-tempoed by Tunnel Trog plus Dust Devil. It possibly gets out-tempoed by Mechwarper plus some kind of mech, like Whirling Zap-O-Matic. Maybe it gets out-tempoed by Whirling Zap-O-Matic plus Rockbiter. Arcane Missiles, Mana Worm. There's a lot of aggressive decks out there where this is just too slow. And even the Yashiraj deck is too slow. So you can see there are some decks out there which look like they could be cool, but they simply get out-muscled because you can kind of boil this down ultimately to some primary decks that are strong. For example, Ice Block Fireball is simply a deck which is dominant in nature. And then maybe you can come up with a deck that's slightly weaker than Ice Block Fireball, but beats Ice Block Fireball. Actually, that doesn't work, but I was thinking Ice Block Forgotten Torch is an interesting take on Ice Block Fireball, for example, and that makes you fatigue a lot slower as well. One of the primary decks out there, again, is Cold Light Oracle Naturalize. You can even Cold Light Naturalize, kind of serving 2 purposes. You can either Cold Light Oracle and then naturalize your opponent's stuff, or you can even naturalize your own Cold Light Oracle. And I haven't quite done the math on whether or not that beats Ice Block Fireball, but I suspect it doesn't. Does it though? And then the question is, how do you beat this? And then the answer is aggressive decks beat this. Because if they naturalize your 1-drop, you're just going to put down 2 more 1-drops. Maybe this is the rock, paper, scissors here. Aggressive decks lose to Ice Block Fireball. Ice Block Fireball loses to Naturalize Cold Light Oracle. Naturalize Cold Light Oracle loses to aggressive decks. And then there are things in between. Maybe there's some magic deck out there which beats 2 of the decks out there. That's kind of my main rock, paper, scissors right now. Of course, instead of all this theory crafting, you just get in there and brawl. But we civilized folks, we like to think about these things, right? So kind of showing the 2 different ways of constructed. You can just get in there and test, or you can... I mean, when you're having only 2 card decks though, and you have so many people testing for you, you start to end the results, like in a normal game of Hearthstone, maybe one deck gets a 60-40 advantage, or in an extreme case, like a 70% win rate, a 30% win rate. But here, if you bring the counter deck, you win 100% of the time. Unless it's one of those games where going first/second is what's different because of who fatigues first, which is actually a thing. But anyways, there's so many decks out there which are cute. For example, people think they're so smart when they come up with something like Soulfire Jaraxxus, Fist of Jaraxxus. But it's like, is this really that unfair? You are drawing basically 2 cards each turn and dealing 8 damage a turn, but is that really that unfair? And you're taking 2 damage yourself, so for a net of 6, and each round takes 3 mana, or perhaps that gets defeated by something like Mind Blast plus Flash Heal, which is a really flexible way to deal 5/gain 5, but ultimately ends up losing to aggressive decks. Well, here's the interesting thing. You might think this loses to Ice Block Fireball, but it turns out that this deck, I believe, beats Ice Block Fireball, though the game is astoundingly boring. Interesting theory out there. Innate Loatheb, which, by the way, is a deck that beats a few of the decks out there in the meta as well. If you innervate out the Loatheb, maybe they never get a Ice Block up. You hit them for 5, you hit them for 10, you hit them for 15, easy. Anyways, looks like this deck loses to the aggressive decks, possibly beats Ice Block Fireball, and assuming you can actually get them to not play their Ice Block, which I think might depend on whether or not you get it on turn 1 or 2. Coldlight Oracle Naturalize loses to Innate Loatheb, I believe. So, seems like a decent place to start. Another interesting thing about this general metagame is that there are some decks that you can bring that seem good, but are actually trash. So, there's this rock, paper, scissors going on. And, okay, this deck isn't like 100%, like you can actually get flooded on Nervates or Loatheb, so sometimes you actually lose games that you should have won, but where was I? There are some decks that are trash, which means that they will lose to 2 of the primary decks, and then the metagame forms around them, and then you come up with something called Nash Equilibrium, where, based off of reasonable play, there should be a certain percentage of all decks in the format. This is a lot more interesting than the question that I used to get asked a lot, which is, if you had only 1 card to fill your entire deck, what would that card be? And it turns out there's a metagame that forms around that format as well. Here we go with the Mechwarper special. Mechwarper beats Loatheb because Mechwarper is not affected by Mechwarper. That's a Mechwarper Gorilla Bot deck. Fascinating. I think I just got outclassed. So this deck loses to Ice Block Fireball. However, it does beat... Does it beat Flash Heal Mind Blast? It might. And does it beat... Well, what are the 3 primary decks? Does it beat Super Aggression? I think it beats Super Aggression. It loses the Ice Block Fireball, beats Super Aggression, and beats the Super Big Card deck. Anyways, we'll play it.
Well played. I concede.
Doesn't beat Naturalize? I think that beats Naturalize. Oh, the 3 decks I was saying. I actually came up with the wrong decks. So there's Ice Block Fireball, which I'm going to start calling IF. There's a Naturalize Coldlight, which I'm going to call NC. And then there's just Aggression, which is like general lump aggression. You come up with the best aggression deck or something. And maybe Aggression is actually Mechwarper dominates the other aggression out there. It's possible that Innate Loatheb ends up being like a trash deck because it loses to 2 of the primary decks then. It beats IF, it loses to MG, Mechwarper Gorilla Bot. It beats Mill. Wait, actually, this deck beats 2 of them. I just happened to queue into the 1 deck. So we're just going to keep doing this one. It depends on the meta. If there's too much MG, then you don't bring IL, Innate Loatheb.
I must protect the wild.
Yeah, pretty much remembering the acronyms takes longer than saying it itself. So I think Innate Loatheb could become dominant in the meta if Ice Block Fireball and Naturalize Cold Light Oracle are 2 of the dominant decks. This deck is also a little bit risky because it might be inconsistent. Sometimes you draw innervates past turn 5. So this deck I'm going to qualify as a trash deck because I can't really imagine what the second card could be to make it any good. And there are some trash decks which are just going to be beat by all 3 of the top tier decks, and I don't quite know what the top tier decks are yet, but we'll find out soon enough. There's so many ideas out there, but the problem is you need to come up with something that beats 2 of the top tier decks, not just 1 of them. And I don't know whether Innate Loatheb is a top tier deck. This would require kind of just sitting down with, what's the word? You sit down with a big chart and then you cross all of the arrows, you point a lot of arrows at other decks, and it's incredible. So he's bringing Alex Strauss' champion Azure Drake, which is a cute idea. I think ultimately it gets outclassed by several decks. However, it might outclass the Loatheb Innervate deck. Although that might be because I drew poorly. I didn't get to play a Loatheb on turn 2. You can see like the meta is possibly more towards minion-based combat, which means that if I just queue in classic Ice Block Fireball, I win every time. And this is where a skill comes about, where you have to sense the meta and get ahead of it. Now the reason why that last deck is trash and yet beat this deck is because trash decks can beat specifically 1 of the decks that are top tier, but it loses to the other 2 decks that are top tier. Now this is pretty much a net deck, and everyone's like, oh, net deck, Ice Block Fireball, yawn, you're playing what everyone else is playing. But it turns out that if people are playing the Brawl for fun, and they're just bringing like general decks, then they'll lose all the time to this deck. Look at that daring mulligan there, because I'll always get at least 1 Ice Block back, I'm sure. Now you can ask, why can there be only 3 top tier decks? And that's an excellent question. It's because of the theory of domination. So out of all the aggressive decks out there, it seems like they all perform the same against Ice Block Fireball. They always lose to Ice Block Fireball. I just queued in against Armorsmith Whirlwind, didn't I? Now the thing about Armorsmith Whirlwind, so this is a trash deck if it is Armorsmith Whirlwind, because it loses to almost all aggressive decks, and it loses to Cold Light Naturalize also, to what I know. But it does beat exactly this deck, which is incredibly unfortunate for me. The game will come down to a really late game, and then I'll Unless it's not Whirlwind, but I suspect it's Whirlwind, and that's sad. Massive sadness.
Armor made to fit.
It's also possible that it's not something that activates these, and then I actually win. That's our only hope, right?
Armor made to
Oh god, is it Whirlwind? It's Whirlwind? No, it's not Whirlwind? Oh, the greed. Oh my god. No, okay, now this might seem ridiculous to say for me to call that a trash deck, but that is a trash deck. Reason is, it only beats specifically this deck. You get some licks attached to you when you are testing out the meta. You dip your toes into it.
Jaina versus Jaina.
You asked for it. Oh, it is on.
If this is the mirror, then I win because I went second. I mean, because I go first, because he fatigues first. It is kind of boring to play it out. If it's aggro, which is the other thing, I also win, so pretty much I always win here. I think.
Let's make magic.
So this is a trash deck because he's playing a 3-2, which gets outclassed by all the aggro decks.
Let's make magic.
This is the kind of deck you'd see perhaps at rank.
Let's make magic.
What's the word? Rank 15 in Constructed? It just generally lumps into all the aggressive decks out there. But doesn't this lose to Mana Worm, for example? Wait, actually, I think I lose. Wait, this deck sucks. No, actually, it's gonna be a little bit of RNG. Maybe this isn't 100-0. So what I need to draw is... Oh, he thought he lost! But he didn't realize my hand was full of fireballs. Okay, so also part of the constructed metagame is you have your ideas of what the top decks are, but over time, playing them and practicing them yourselves can make you realize, oh wait, Ice Block Fireball is unstoppable because they can is not unstoppable because they can just choose. Sometimes you run out of ice blocks in time, if you're aggressive enough. So maybe that general idea of Mechwarper Gorilla Bot was good. No, actually, every single deck I have queued into so far, every single deck has lost to Naturalized Cold Light Oracle. So I'm going to bring like a top tier deck, and then we'll show them all. I'm of course not saying that Innervate Naturalized, or I'm not saying that Naturalized Cold Light Oracle beats everything. What I'm just saying is that it happens to have beat everything in the meta so far. Except Mechwarper. But this beats so much of the non-optimized decks out there. Now I just happen to have queued into Trash, Possessed Villager, which unfortunately, I don't know. I don't know this matchup. This is close. I don't know if Possessed Villager puts on enough aggro to beat Naturalized. I mean, it's a really cheap card, which is unfortunate for me, yet it is also a bad card, so maybe it doesn't... It's complicated. It's just that this deck gets hard countered by Mechwarper X. And I'm not sure if Mechwarper Metaltooth Leaper or Mechwarper Gorilla Bot is better. It might be that they have different different matchups though. Power Overwhelming Possessed Villager. It saddens me that I'm losing to such a trash deck. Trash. Well played. But minion-based decks, I guess, beat Naturalized Cold-Eyed Oracle. Maybe the best play at the start turns out to be simply to bring the best aggro deck to begin with. What if you actually did a hybrid? What hero power is best? I don't know. I think it doesn't really matter. I'll choose this one though. I'm not sure between Mechwarper Metaltooth or Mechwarper Gorilla Bot yet. I think it's close.
Gul'dan versus
Now, this might look ridiculous as I call decks trash and lose to them, but as Khadgar says, knowledge is power. And wow, never lucky. It's okay, you were never gonna play Mechwarper turn 2 anyways. Probably. Maybe. Am I wrong? No, you do play Mechwarper turn 2.
online.
Okay, so the theory is you beat Ice Block by killing them enough times before they kill you. Which I think is a reasonable thing to happen.
Portals online.
Deal 2 damage to a non-mech minion.
Engage.
Wait, what the? When I get an extra mana? 9/9. Okay, so it's possible that this Ice Block Fireball thing just loses to too good of aggro. What I originally thought was a hard counter to the minion decks turns out to not be a hard counter. An interesting development in the meta. Only made possible by having tried it out. Also worth mentioning is that if I had played this under a warrior, it would have been stronger against this deck because I could armor up, which might make it so that he has slightly less chance. He can only start fireballing me on turn 7. And then he would need to do it 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. So that's 5 cards. In addition, past that, those 5 cards, so he's only 7 cards, and that maximum 11, which means 8, he'll draw 13 cards. So 5 of the cards have to be fireball, and 6 of the cards have to be ice block, I believe. Although there might be something with the Fire Blast, which changes the math. So this is kind of going to be a little bit RNG. Actually, he only needs 5 Fireballs, because I chose Warlock. Oh, a very clever move. Fire Blast instead of Fireball. And saves a Fireball. Yes, smart. Also, I completely forgot about the idea to... I didn't even remember that you can discover heal bots because I've been playing Standard so much. So I misplayed this. I was so confused. I thought that you could only do Standard, but I'm just dumb. He didn't fireball me there, which indicates that he's not playing fireball. I don't know if that is better or worse, but he's gonna run out of ice blocks someday. Wait, can you put two of the same card in a deck? Nah, surely not. At some point, you definitely could run out of ice block, as I did in that one game. You can't run two of the same card, okay. He needed exactly that mix of cards. Well, no, he didn't need exactly that mix, apparently. And I also needed to be using this hero. I should not play a Warlock. Having a useful hero power is pretty useful. Look, like, he only has one card left. What if he had... Okay, I guess you just always need more ice... So, Ice Lance is... My mistake was choosing, Warlock with this deck. Warrior is clearly the best class. Mechwarper Gorilla. Grumble grumble. Also, my mistake was playing too many cards. I misplayed that one. Would have won either way. Otherwise.
Versus Jaina.
You asked for it.
It's questionable whether or not I need to make the matchup this good by choosing Warrior. I'll also admit that much.
Amazing.
Astonishing.
Alright, let's see what he's up to this game. The good old classic Mana Worm Arcane Missiles. Does that get outclassed, or is it outclassing me? We shall see.
Armory up. Portals online. Armory up. Armory online. Online.
So this is gonna be a board control fight. Probably this one.
Well played.
Screwjank, Demolisher. No, I actually just win. Doesn't matter which one of these I choose.
Defensive systems online.
So this is why I was calling this deck trash earlier, because it just gets outclassed by Mechwarper plus X. So 3 categories of decks. There's Mechwarper X decks, which beat any aggro deck, and it has the same general idea as aggro decks as well. And then there's decks that beat this deck, so that should be in the meta. And then so on and so forth.
Engage.
Rapid speed.
Engage.
Well played.
Well played.
In fact, this deck arguably also loses to Ice Block Fireball. Or Ice Block Icelands, which is the same exact deck. So that's 2 decks that are the primary meta, which both lose. But the surprise factor is that the Gorilla bot can discover the Heal bot, which lets it beat the Ice Block deck. Sick, yeah. And this deck, of course, defeats Mill. Maybe this is just the strongest deck. As the metagame forms together, people start realizing that this is the deck to beat. And then the question is, what beats this deck? And the answer, I actually don't know. Maybe this is just the optimal deck. So either there are no Brawl decks that can beat this deck, or there are, but I'm not entirely sure. Mostly because being able to discover some key cards might be the key.
The pleasure is mine.
Mechwarper, Metal Tooth Leaper. Yeah, that could definitely beat it.
Portals online.
The Brotherhood shall prevail.
Oh. Backstab Edwin, maybe? I don't know.
Hurry up. Hurry
We'll see whether or not this has any hope.
Hurry up. Portals online.
Non-grill bot. No, never lucky.
Hurry up. Portals online. Engage.
I did.
It's possible that hero power is bad in this because I tried to pick this to counter exactly Freeze Mage, but maybe you don't need the hero power of this one. Maybe that's why Warlock is better. Because you're supposed to beat the other one. Perhaps it's the Warlock deck that's OP. Gorilla Bot, Mechwarper. And then you can still draw cards. Because it comes down to be a board control. So it also depends if you want to tilt your deck a little bit more towards board control, or you tilt it a little bit more towards only spells.
Victory or death! Your soul shall be mine!
Yeah, what kind of deck are we facing here? Well, it's the mirror, except I have Life Tap, which is superior to his Armor Up, which is going to be pointless. Small tweaks in your deck decisions can alter the entire course of the game.
Online. Hurry up. Portals online.
Oh. Mechwarper Demolisher. We'll see.
Hurry up. Hurry online. Portals online.
Voltron. No, that's never good here. Demolisher is no good when I'm behind on the board. That might be good, considering that he's only playing one card a turn from here on out. Yeah.
Engage.
In this case, going first/second looks like it might be the big deal breaker. However, at the same time, though, I'm not entirely sure who's going to win still. Because it's going to be tough for him to deal with this 8/8. He gets the initial board control of these Demolishers, and that's going to be tough to beat. But it should be difficult to beat a Fel Reaver. However, I'm not going to be able to play a Fel Reaver, which is a problem. I don't know, I'll be able to play it eventually. And then there's a lot of RNG involved in these Demolishers too. This is actually a little bit of an RNG match on who goes first versus second. Since him going second allowed him to, I think, get this combat a little bit early. But still, how is he going to stop an 8/8?
Hurry up. Portals
So the way I see it, slowly I'm going to start getting board control. And the question is the point that I gain board control going to be enough to overcome this? Kind of an interesting puzzle.
online. Hurry up. Portals online.
And then there's also the concept if I had actually chosen a different hero power, I would have quite possibly won. Maybe. This is the turn where I actually get board control though.
Powering up. Portals online.
Oh, and also if I get the heal bot, I just win. So it's a little bit of RNG there too. So he can never get board control here after this next turn of mine. Huh. I think I should try to get more guys on the board. Oh, never lucky with this discovery. This is gonna be really close. I think I win. Now the question is, do I want leper gnomes? So obviously I do that. Whenever enemy minion dies, summon a leper gnome. I don't think I want the leper gnomes. The leper gnomes will take longer to kill him. So I play the 5 and the 3. That's the most power I can put out on the board. Oh, and then the 1.
Powering up. Portals online.
This will die actually, which will mean, well, I'll have one of these die. Probably worth. Yeah, I win. Wow, this is gonna be pretty close. I mean, this was pretty close.
Engage. Engage. Powering up. Portals online.
I was surprised to find that there could be such close matchups in this game.
Well played.
It's junk bunk.
And by the way, I still actually have a turn spare. You can play a card, but I don't fatigue. I can fatigue for 1. There, I let him win. You guys happy?
Well played.
I'm uncertain if you actually ever get to use life tap in this game, but this is now a pretty interesting puzzle. Thanks for subbing, Not Mesmerize, and Linderoth.
Gul'dan versus Malfurion.
Now I'm just kind of interested in... I mean, surely there's a deck that beats this, right? And yet, I can't think of one that consistently beats it. I'm not sure if Innervate Yashiraj beats this deck. I actually think it loses to it. I believe this deck outputs more DPS. Innervate Mana Wraith, I think that does beat this. Yeah. Although if your opponent goes coin Mechwarper, then you lose. But most people wouldn't coin Mechwarper.
Online.
Doomsayer sounds pretty good against this deck too, yeah. So basically, you use this deck to cash in a lot of wins first, and then when the meta changes to that, you start thinking about, okay, what beats this? Oh, what if I do that? Smart.
Powering portals online.
Like, what if this is Innervate Yashiraj? That's not even good enough. Maybe he drew a lot of Yashirajas. Even if it's Innervate Deathwing, they're both too slow to this deck. Yogg-Saron, that's a wild card. But probably, on average, we'll lose. The wild card. It's a really bad deck. That deck qualifies as trash, but hilarious. Hilarious trash.
Spectacular. Extraordinary. I concede. I must protect the one. Your soul shall be
The initial thought was that this deck loses to Ice Block Fireball, but I've grown convinced that due to the ability to discover the heal bot, it's not losing. Plus, you can run a Warrior if there's too many of them. Plus, you can run them out of Ice Block, potentially before you die, due to the idea of
Powering up. Portals online.
if it's naturalized. Yeah, this deck just loses. I mean, naturalized just loses to this deck. So this deck is like crushing my expectations in my kind of first imagined top 3, which is going to be a metagame of aggro and... Anyways, where was I?
a natural state.
Crushed. It's because this Mechwarper synergy is just too high. They can only get so many naturalizes. And your cards are all free, basically, anyways.
He's too far.
Powering up. Powering online. Portals online. Powering up. Portals online.
So this deck beats aggressive decks. It is the dominant aggressive deck. It beats mill decks, and it beats Ice Block Fireball, in theory. That's science right there.
Well played. I concede.
I think it does quite... I think it might win against Yasharaj because he might discover Taunt also.
The light shall bring victory.
Your soul shall be mine.
Now the problem with the counter to this deck, supposedly, which is Innervate Mana Wraith, which by the way still loses if you are up against someone who goes second and they coin Mechwarper you, is that Innervate Mana Wraith loses to so many other decks out there right now. You'd have to wait for the metagame to become heavily Mechwarperized. Huh. Shadow Boxer. I can't imagine that deck working. But we'll see. Oh, they can't coin Mechwarper if you innervate it. Okay, so basically Mana Wraith also always wins. That's true. Fine. I give you that.
Powering up. Portals online. Powering up. Portals online.
I got unlucky by not getting a fourth one.
Online.
Sure. Alright, let's see what his second trick is. That was a pretty weak turn 3 play for me. Does he think he can beat my mechs by boxing them? Light of the Naru, Shadow Boxer. So, this is known as a trash deck, which just can't win against the standard decks. I should tap because if I get Mechwarper, yeah, that pays for itself. Okay, so that's my quick assessment of this brawl. I think the interesting thing is possibly revisiting it. Like, if this actually ran a long course and there was a ranked for it, people would gravitate towards Mechwarper Gorillabot being the best. And then the question would be, what beats Mechwarper Gorillabot, as that becomes the tier 1 deck by far. And then you would come up with the counters, which would be like Doomsayer X, because that deck is slow and can't beat Doomsayer. So as long as you play either Doomsayer or the Innervate Mana Wraith deck, then you're good against those. So then that would be like 2 branches out, and then eventually you would have enough of those decks that the Mechwarper deck, which seems to be like the primary deck, might get beat. There is also this theory that the Metal Tooth Leaper is OP. And yes, Gorillabot, Metal Tooth Leaper, they beat and lose to different things. Where, for example, I think Gorillabot has a higher chance of winning against Freeze Mage, or Ice Block Mage, because you can get the heal bots and you can get some taunts sometimes. But yeah, that's certainly an even more aggressive version of this. So the meta would eventually settle down into some kind of equilibrium where playing the strongest deck is not always correct, because you can beat the strongest deck with some hard counter, for example Doomsayer or Mana Wraith. It's just that those decks aren't even worth considering right now because people are playing other trash decks, and trash decks will beat Doomsayer or Mana Wraith because those cards are so specifically teched towards this deck. Anyways, isn't that such an interesting look into the microcosm of how metas form and develop? We got a lot done in 2 hours, which is basically 3 months of constructed season, in a very small way. It might look like, to the untrained eye, oh, Xyon, Mechwarper, OP, just play Mechwarper. And for now, on day 1, in the early part, that's absolutely true. And it's possible that the Brawl doesn't get enough plays, that the other decks that come and beat it in very specific ways ever get introduced. And I'll even go one step further and propose that perhaps, and I don't have to play a bunch of games to know that this is possibly true, but perhaps this is actually the dominant deck, Mechwarper, Metal Tooth Leaper. The amount of cutthroatness of this deck is very high. Tough to beat a board full of high attack and 3 health guys on specifically turn 3 on either side. The only way I lose with this deck is if I queue into a very specific counter deck, which I would find very small chance of happening. Now, one of the interesting things is, due to not being able to discover Healbot anymore, I wonder if it then loses to Ice Block Fireball. This deck might then lose to Ice Block Fireball, in fact. Oh, and by the way, Bolster plus Target Dummy is a cute idea which I've seen repeated a lot, but has lost, I think would lose to both versions of the Mechwarper deck. Dr. Boom. Now, as good as that seemed, that's actually a trash deck. It's no good. It doesn't beat a lot of things. It loses to other variants of Innervate, so it's like strictly dominated. It loses to this deck, it loses to... Anyways. Although I did need to draw a... Anyways. You do need to draw exactly, well, 3 or more Mechwarpers. This is the ideal draw.
I can see.
Ha ha ha. So I thought this was a really interesting side look into how metas develop and how they evolve, and how even this ridiculous looking deck can be defeated by humble cards such as Doomsayer and such as Mana Wraith. I think, sadly enough, Circle of Healing Alkanized Soul Priest might be too slow, whereas Alkanized Soul Priest Circle of Healing might be fast enough against the Gorilla Bot version of the deck. I think it's also worth noting that when we look back at the start of the meta, when I started playing, I was throwing around trash decks, the terminology, with an incomplete knowledge of the meta, and sometimes, when you're woefully ignorant of the meta, you can think some things are trash, but they aren't trash. For example, I thought Innate Loatheb was good because it would beat the top decks of the meta, but I was wrong because the top decks of the meta were not what I thought they were. And then I got beat by a top deck of the meta, and I was like, oh yeah, that's actually pretty good. So I was playing a trash deck for a while too. Fun twist.